On my birthday, my parents hosted a dinner with 100 relatives just to disown me. My dad handed me a bill for $248,000. Every cent we wasted raising you. Pay or never contact us again. My sister grabbed my car keys from the table. They'd already transferred the title to me. They even brought my boss to fire me on the spot as I stood there in silence. I walked out without a word. 4 days later. They are calling me. The string quartet stopped mid-measure. It was a Bach concerto, and the sudden silence felt heavy and wrong in the manicured garden of the estate. My father, William, tapped his champagne glass with the stem of a silver fork, the sound cutting through the stunned whispers of the 100 guests. I was standing near the edge of the patio, trying to smooth the creases out of my work blazer. I expected a toast, maybe even a reluctant acknowledgement of my recent promotion at the firm. I had rushed straight from the server room, still in my professional slacks, and the scent of ozone and stale coffee clung faintly to my clothes, a stark contrast to the expensive perfumes and cut grass around me. Instead, William looked directly at me. His smile, usually reserved for clients, was razor-sharp. He handed me a heather leather-bound portfolio. "Happy birthday, Allison." It wasn't a gift. The weight of the leather was unfamiliar, almost menacing. I opened it to find a single, itemized document. An invoice. The number at the bottom made my hands tremble. $248,000. William's voice boomed, perfectly projected across the lawn. Room. Board. An inconvenience. He let the words hang in the air, allowing the crowd to process the number. His gaze never left mine. "You've been a bad investment, Allison. Consider this as cutting our losses." The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, a vacuum where decency used to be. I felt the collective stare of every relative, every socialite, every business associate present. This wasn't a private argument, it was a public execution. My mother, Christine, didn't gasp. She didn't rush forward to snatch the invoice from my father's hands or apologize to the guests for the cruel theater. She simply smoothed the front of her silk dress, her expression perfectly neutral, and took the microphone from William. Then, she handed it to my sister, Brooklyn. That transfer of power told me everything I needed to know. It was choreographed. Brooklyn stepped forward, creating a visual dissonance that was impossible to miss. She was wearing a strapless designer gown that shimmered under the garden lights, something that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, combined. Her hair was professionally styled, her skin glowing from a recent spa day in Tulum. I, on the other hand, was still in my work clothes, having sacrificed a weekend for the very job that paid for my own rent and utilities, freeing them of my expense. The contrast wasn't accidental. It was a statement. She was the investment. I was the expense. "The keys, Allison," Brooklyn said, her voice amplified by the speakers, grating against the heavy silence. She didn't whisper it. She performed it. She held out a perfectly manicured hand, palm up, waiting for the tribute. Dade transferred the title to the winner of the family this morning. Someone who actually appreciates the brand. I looked at Brooklyn's manicured hand, then at the car key in my own. It wasn't a luxury vehicle. It was a 5-year-old sedan, reliable but unremarkable. The vehicle I used to commute into the city to earn the salary that paid my own bills. But technically, my father's name, William's name, was still on the title from when I was 21. I hadn't thought to change it because I thought we were family. I thought ownership was a formality, a piece of paper, not a weapon. The contrast between us was a physical blow. Brooklyn, shimmering and golden under the spotlights, the investment that had yielded a high social return. Me, the overlooked expense, still smelling faintly of server room humidity. It wasn't accidental. It was designed to hurt. I placed the key in her palm. The metal felt cold against her warm, soft skin. Brooklyn didn't look at me. She looked at the key. Her smile, when it finally emerged, was colder than the metal. She closed her fingers around it slowly, like she was crushing a bug. Finally, she leaned into the microphone, creating a small, feedback-laced sigh that was half laugh, half triumph. Someone had to take out the trash. I felt the burning emptiness where the key had been. They weren't done. The dismantling of my personal life was just the opening act. The collective silence of the guests shifted, expectant. They were witnessing a high society spectacle, too polite, or perhaps too fascinated, to intervene. William gestured toward the back of the crowd, summoning someone forward. My stomach turned over, a sick, heavy lurch, as I recognized the figure who stepped reluctantly into the harsh circle of light. Daniel West, my department head. Daniel was a weak man. The kind of middle manager who survived by agreeing with whoever had the most money and power in the room. He looked terrified, his eyes darting to his shoes, then to William, then finally, quickly to me. He was pale, but he was also obedient. "Daniel," William said, his voice booming with false conviviality. "Why don't you share the news? We believe in transparency here." Daniel swallowed hard. He didn't take the microphone, nor did he need it. The garden was absolutely silent, everyone leaning forward to catch the final blow. "Allison," he began, his voice cracking. Based on the character references provided by your parents this week, and the financial liabilities they have highlighted, the company feels you are a security risk." He paused, a tiny, miserable man caught between two giants. "You're terminated, effective Monday. Please don't come to the office. We'll mail your personal effects." The air left my lungs. The ground didn't shake, the world didn't spin. It simply went still. This wasn't just a bad birthday. This wasn't a family spat over money or affection. This was a calculated, strategic demolition of my existence. They hadn't just decided to stop loving me, they had decided to erase me. They wanted me unemployed, immobile, and indebted by the $248,000 invoice. They wanted me to have absolutely nothing, so that I would have to crawl back to them for everything: a job, money, shelter, and worst of all, their validation. I looked around the garden one last time. The guests were statues in expensive suits and gowns. No one moved. No one spoke up. I stood alone on the manicured grass, the memory of the invoice heavy in the leather portfolio I still held, the space where my car key used to be burning in my pocket. I looked at William, who was beaming. I looked at Christine, who was examining her manicure. I looked at Brooklyn, who was already dangling my old key ring on her finger like a toy. And in that moment, the shock fractured. It didn't break into sadness or tears. It broke into something much harder, much sharper, much colder. It broke into clarity. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a scene. Emotion is just bad data in an audit, and I deleted it. I looked William straight in his triumphant eyes, placed the leather portfolio into my tote bag, turned around, and walked. The gravel crunched under my sensible shoes, the only sound in the suffocating silence. It was the sound of my old life ending, and the sound of a new system initializing. I walked out of the garden without uttering a single syllable, the crunch of the gravel marking my path away from the suffocating spectacle. I walked past the shocked, silent guests and onto the street. The walk home was 3 miles. It gave me time. It gave me time to feel the blisters forming on my heels from the sensible, yet unforgiving, shoes I had worn straight from the office. It gave me time to feel the cold reality settling in my chest, harder and heavier with every step. The sun had just begun to set, bleeding orange and purple over the suburban skyline, but the air felt thin and metallic. My mind, stripped of the immediate shock, began to categorize the data. I didn't turn on the lights when I finally unlocked the door to my small, quiet apartment. The air inside smelled like stale coffee and the ghost of the work I should have been doing. I sat down at my desk, Not because I was tired, but because it was the only place that felt honest. I opened my laptop. I didn't navigate to a job board. I didn't open my resume. I opened a terminal window. The black screen and the blinking green cursor were the only things that felt predictable and clean in the wake of the chaos. I am Allison, the cybersecurity analyst. My job is to find vulnerabilities, to trace breaches, to understand how systems fail. And my family was a failing system. As I typed in the command lines, initializing the search protocols, I usually reserved for high-stakes corporate audits, I allowed myself to think about the invoice. $248,000. It was a staggering number, precise and deliberately cruel. The specificity was key to the cruelty. But as I stared at the blinking cursor, I realized something fundamental. The invoice wasn't just a bill. It was a confession. Healthy love isn't a ledger. You don't track the cost of diapers, or the price of school lunches, or the gas for the car you use to commute, unless you view your child as an asset that isn't performing. This was the transactional love trap I had been raised in. Narcissistic parents don't raise children. They make investments. And when the investment doesn't yield the return they want, when the child doesn't marry rich, or become famous, or reflect their own glory back at them, they liquidate. They cut their losses. The invoice wasn't about the money itself. It was about ownership. By assigning a cost to my existence, they were telling me that my entire being had a price tag. And since I wasn't paying dividends in social status or compliant obedience, I was in debt. They wanted to foreclose on my life, to ensure I owed them so deeply that I would never be able to stand on my own. I thought about the times I had quietly transferred funds from my savings to pay the utility bills at the Manor so the power wouldn't be cut off before one of their parties. I remembered Brooklyn getting a new nose job paid for by my parents because, as my mother put it, confidence is key to branding. I thought about the years I spent fixing their home network, securing their private accounts, and quietly cleaning up their digital messes, always working, never asking for a single cent of payment or praise. The true insult, the reason for the calculated hatred, became crystal clear. They didn't hate me because I was a failure. They hated me because I was competent. They hated me because I didn't need them to fix my problems or validate my worth. For people like William and Christine, independence is the ultimate, unforgivable insult. It is a bug in the system they rely on for control. The code on my screen stopped scrolling. The search was complete. I took a deep, steadying breath and watched the blinking cursor await my next command. I was no longer the daughter they humiliated. I was the analyst on the outside, and I had just gained administrative access to their entire system. The silence in my apartment was heavy, broken only by the hum of the laptop fan. My phone, lying abandoned on the desk, was screaming. It vibrated against the wood surface, like a trapped insect, buzzing frantically with the fallout of their little garden party performance. I didn't pick it up. I just watched the notifications scroll down the lock screen, cataloging the data as it came in. First came Miasar's gaslighting. A text from my mother, Christine. We just wanted you to see reality, Allison. Sometimes love looks like a hard lesson. Call us when you are ready to grow up. The message was dripping with false concern. The predictable maneuver of the aggressor claiming the victim needs correction. Then came the performance art. A notification from Instagram. My sister, Brooklyn, had posted a photo. It was a selfie in the driver's seat of my sedan, the car they had just stolen. She was pouting. The lighting perfectly adjusted to catch the glint of a tear that I knew she had summoned on command for the camera. The caption read, "So sad when family turns toxic. Sometimes you have to cut people off to protect your peace." Healing. Boundaries. She was already positioning herself as the brave survivor. Finally, the sex threat. An email from William. The subject line was chillingly formal. Repayment schedule. The body of the email was brief and brutal. If you do not set up a payment plan for the $248,000 by Friday, we will pursue legal action for theft of services. Do not test me. They expected me to be reading these messages through a veil of tears. They expected me to be typing out frantic, apologetic paragraphs, begging for forgiveness, promising to pay whatever they asked, just to be let back into the fold. They were betting on the version of me they had constructed in their heads. The weak, dependent daughter who needed their validation to breathe. They had completely forgotten what I actually do for a living. I don't deal in drama. I deal in threat assessment and mitigation. These communications weren't emotional pleas. They were vectors of attack. I swiped the notifications away, archiving them into a secure folder on my encrypted drive. I didn't block them. You never block a source of intelligence. You just mute the noise, allowing the data stream to continue unhindered for analysis later. I turned back to my laptop. The forensic search on their finances was running quietly in the background, the progress bar inching slowly toward completion. While that cooked, I had another, more immediate fire to put out. My career. Daniel West, my former boss, was a weak link, a compromised node in the corporate chain. He had fired a lead cybersecurity analyst, based entirely on hearsay to impress a man in a tuxedo. A man who was nothing more than an insecure, wealthy socialite. That was a tactical error of breathtaking liability. I didn't call Daniel. You don't negotiate with a compromised node. You bypass it and connect to the core system. I opened my secure contact list and found the direct public line for Ethan Miller, the regional director. Ethan knew my name. Last year, when a ransomware attack had threatened to encrypt the entire West Coast database, I was the one who found the breach. I was the one who stayed up for 72 hours straight to patch the vulnerability, while Daniel was coordinating from a golf course. Ethan knew my value was measured in millions of dollars of protected assets, not in familial gossip. I dialed. She picked up on the second ring, her voice sharp and unsurprised by a late-night call. Allison, it's late. Is the server down? The network is secure, Ethan, I said, keeping my voice flat and professional, as if reporting a minor system bug. But my employment status isn't. I needed to inform you that as of 2 hours ago, I was terminated by Daniel West. Terminated. On what grounds? He attended a private party hosted by my parents. Based on a personal dispute regarding family finances, he decided I was a security risk. There was no human resources presence, no performance review, no exit interview. Just a public dismissal in front of 100 socialites. There was a silence on the line. It was the silence of a woman who understands corporate liability. He fired a lead analyst at a cocktail party based on personal gossip. Yes. Ethan, I'm calling to clarify if this is the new company protocol for personnel management. Because if it is, I need to know where to send my badge. The quiet professionalism in my voice was the most powerful leverage I had. Give me 5 minutes, Ethan said. The line went dead. I knew she would act not out of loyalty, but out of risk mitigation. And that was far more reliable than love. I didn't stare at the phone after Ethan disconnected the line. Staring would have indicated hope, or worse, dependence. Instead, I went to the kitchen and began the methodical process of making coffee. I ground the beans, measured the water, and waited for the familiar hiss of the espresso machine, allowing the quiet ritual to anchor me. I poured a cup, black and strong, and returned to the desk. 4 minutes and 30 seconds later, my personal email pinged. It was an automated notification from the corporate system. Access restored. A second email followed instantly, this time from Ethan Miller herself. The message was concise, reflecting her pragmatic nature. Daniel West has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a formal investigation into professional misconduct and violation of company policy. Your termination is voided. You are reinstated effective immediately with a 10% retention adjustment to your salary for the clerical error. Take Monday off. We'll talk Tuesday. I took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter, but it tasted like a sweet, undeniable victory. The first pillar of their control had just crumbled into dust. They had thought they stripped me of my livelihood, leaving me destitute and desperate, forcing me to beg them for a job interview. Instead, their strategic error had just handed me a substantial raise and removed the only truly incompetent manager standing in my way. They tried to break my career. They only streamlined it. The validation was cold, corporate, and absolute. This shift in power, achieved not through tears or confrontation, but through professional competence, was the final required input for the next stage of the operation. My internal emotional state shifted from cold strategy to quiet, focused confidence. I had proven my value to the world outside their toxic sphere. Now, I was ready to prove their worthlessness. I looked back at the terminal window. The progress bar for the forensic audit of my parents' finances hit 100%. The process was complete. The system had compiled all available data, cross-referenced public records, and decrypted their private files. The truth, in raw numbers and documented transactions, was ready. I cracked my knuckles, a small physical ritual that always preceded deep dive work, and leaned in toward the glow of the monitor. The air in the apartment felt electric with possibility. If Christine thought losing my job was going to break me. They had no idea what was about to happen now that I had looked inside their bank accounts. The invoice for $248,000 was just a smokescreen, a theatrical distraction. The real story, the real failure of their system, was waiting for me in the data log. The meticulous, years-long structure of their deception was laid out on my screen, waiting for the analyst to expose the vulnerability and trace the breach back to its origin. I initiated the file opening sequence, prepared for the complicated layers of shell corporations and hidden accounts. I wasn't just looking at a family's budget anymore. I was looking at a crime scene. I was looking for the flaw that would bring their carefully constructed world of entitlement crashing down. I was looking for proof that their transactional love was, in reality, nothing more than outright fraud. The hunt began with the very item Brooklyn had claimed with such glee just a few hours ago: the car. I stared at the spreadsheet on my screen. It wasn't merely a family's financial history, it was a map of moral decay, a detailed record of their deceit. I wasn't looking at budgeting, I was looking at evidence. I started with the car, the 5-year-old sedan that Brooklyn had so gleefully reclaimed in the garden, confirming my initial cold suspicion. William had claimed he owned it, that he was simply taking back his property. He lied. I traced the vehicle identification number through the Department of Motor Vehicles database, referencing it with the bank records I had just decrypted. The initial purchase of the vehicle didn't come from William's personal checking account. It came from an account ending in 4092. I queried the origin of that account. It was a Waz trust, the Allison trust. My grandmother, she had died 10 years ago. I had been told she left nothing but old, minor jewelry. But here it was, a trust fund established in my name, meant to mature when I turned 21. The balance should have been substantial. It was zero. William hadn't bought that car for me out of the goodness of his heart. He had bought it with my money, put his name on the title, and then loaned it to me to keep me grateful and compliant for the 7 years that followed. Now, he had given my stolen property to Brooklyn as a twisted reward for her loyalty in humiliating me. That was petty theft and emotional cruelty woven together, but the real anomaly was buried deeper, in the investment folder labeled Family Assets. High Yield. My parents had always postured as savvy, trustworthy investors. Managing private portfolios for family members who weren't financially literate. I pulled up the records for Uncle Kevin and Aunt Michelle. They were good people. Trusting people who lived modestly far away. For the last 5 years, they had been transferring $5,000 a month to William. Believing they were investing in a high-yield tech fund that William supposedly ran. I followed the money trail. The $5,000 transfers hit William's main holding account, sat there for 24 hours, and then were wired out. Not to a stock market exchange, not to a legitimate tech fund, but to an account labeled Fessich BS Lifestyle LLCs. I stared at the initials. BS Lifestyle. Brooklyn Scarlet. The cold realization was absolute. It was a shell company meticulously constructed and maintained, whose sole purpose was to act as a personal slush fund. I clicked on the LLC details. The transactions were an itemized record of extravagance, paying off exorbitant credit cards, leasing luxury vehicles Brooklyn drove, and funding endless influencer trips to Tulum and Paris. Uncle Kevin and Aunt Michelle weren't investing in their future. They were funding Brooklyn's wardrobe and social media brand. The theft was not just from me. It was from the people who trusted William the most. I sat back in my chair. The glow of the monitor illuminating the dark apartment. This changed everything. This wasn't just narcissistic parenting. This was a felony. This was S-wire fraud, pure and simple. But the most damning piece of evidence wasn't the money itself. It was the ASI signatures. On every single withdrawal slip from the BS Lifestyle LLC, right next to William's jagged scroll, was a precise, looped practice signature. Brooklyn's. This brought us to the true nature of the enabler's debt. The golden child always pleads ignorance. They claim they are just the passive, clueless recipient of the parents' generosity. They say, "I didn't know where the money came from, I just spent it." It's a convenient lie used to absolve themselves of guilt. But here was the proof. Willful ignorance is not innocency. It is a strategy. Brooklyn was not a clueless bystander. The digital logs proved she was an active accomplice, authorizing the theft of our aunt and uncle's life savings to fund her own manufactured lifestyle. The $248,000 invoice they handed me was theater. But this data was a gas subpoena. The evidence was compiled. The spreadsheet detailed the fraudulent transfers, the signatures confirming Brooklyn's active role, and the Allison trust documents proving William had stolen my inheritance to buy the car they later used to humiliate me. The $248,000 invoice was not merely a lie, it was a distraction to mask the years of grand theft. The data was a quiet, incontrovertible weapon. I backed up the files to an external encrypted drive, securing the proof. My hands were steady, performing the meticulous, necessary work of threat neutralization. There was no shaking, no second-guessing, only the calm clarity that comes from knowing the precise liability of your opponent. The time for analysis was over. The time for deployment was now. I navigated to my email client. The key to this final phase was not the volume of information, but the fussy delivery of it. I didn't need to argue, plead, or explain the betrayal. The data itself would perform the required function. I attached a single PDF document to an email. I named the file simply, yet damningly, as Family Under Ledger of Oil. The recipient list was short and specific, targeting every actor and every victim in the system: William, Christine, Brooklyn, Uncle Kevin, and Aunt Michelle. I didn't waste time composing a message. No context, no accusation, no farewell was needed. The document spoke for itself, delivering the technical, legal truth without emotional noise. I hit send. The moment the email left my outbox, I disconnected my phone from the service and unplugged my router from the wall. I cut the wire. I starved the source. Silence terrifies narcissists. They thrive on drama, on the frantic, emotional, begging reaction of their victims. By refusing to engage, by ensuring they could not text, Call or email me back with threats, please, or further gaslighting. I deprived them of the fuel they needed to control the narrative. I denied them the satisfaction of a scene. They would panic in a vacuum of their own making. I set my phone on the desk, the dark, inert screen a testament to my final independence. I slept soundly. I didn't dream. I simply rested, the first true, restful sleep I'd had since walking out of that garden. Knowing the calculated chaos I had just unleashed on the failing system. When I reconnected the router the next morning, the floodgates opened. My phone screamed again, vibrating with dozens of notifications. The texts from William were initially rage, swiftly transitioning to desperate demands. Christine's messages dissolved instantly from accusation to manipulative concern. Your father is unwell, Allison. You're destroying your home. Brooklyn's Instagram, briefly, was taken down, then reposted with an even more theatrical, but less convincing, plea for privacy. But one voicemail stood out. It was from Uncle Kevin. His voice was not angry, not demanding, but profoundly relieved. You didn't destroy the family, Allison, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You just turned on the lights. Michelle and we saw the transfers. We saw where our retirement went. I'm calling my lawyer this morning. Thank you. Thank you for telling us the truth. The legal system was now initialized. My work was finished. The debt collector had become the auditor. And the evidence was irrefutable. The collapse of their system was swift. Uncle Kevin and Aunt Michelle's lawyer moved immediately, freezing the assets of the BS Lifestyle LLC and filing charges based on the evidence I provided. The federal sentencing guidelines for wire fraud, which I had meticulously reviewed, were severe. They couldn't fight it. The data was digital and undeniable. 2 weeks later, my father, William, pounded on my apartment door. I looked through the peephole. He looked broken. The impeccably tailored suit was rumpled, his hair unkempt, and his face was drawn and pale, stripped of the arrogance that had defined his existence. He was no longer the imposing judge of the garden party. He was a terrified, small man facing the end of his social and financial life. Allison, please? He pleaded through the wood, his voice thick and desperate. We did it for the family legacy. You have to retract the email. You have to save me from prison. I didn't unlock the door. I didn't need to see him fully to know the truth. His plea was not an apology. It was a last-ditch attempt at control, framing his crimes as a noble effort on behalf of the family legacy. You didn't give me a legacy, I replied. My voice calm and firm, directed at the chain lock and the thick wood. You gave me an invoice. I slid a single piece of paper through the crack beneath the door. Careful not to touch his trembling fingers. It was a printed summary of the federal sentencing guidelines for wire fraud, the minimum and maximum penalties highlighted in sharp black ink. You wanted to teach me the cost of living, I said, leaning close to the wood. This is the cost of lying. I shut the door and locked the deadbolt, adding the final security measure to the barrier between our lives. His hammering continued for a moment, then dissolved into incoherent sobs, a sound I simply muted in my mind, categorizing it as non-critical background noise. The family estate, the symbol of their perceived dominance, and the stage for my humiliation, was seized to pay restitution to Uncle Kevin and Aunt Michelle. Christine divorced William shortly thereafter, citing public humiliation, and naturally, her lack of involvement in the technical aspects of the financial scandal. Neatly, preserving her social standing with the remaining polite statues of the community, Brooklyn lost her sponsors and her massive social media following overnight, once the source of the BS lifestyle funding was exposed as theft. The golden child, stripped of her golden assets, was forced into a retail job selling the very brands she used to promote an irony that provided a final, quiet satisfaction. Weeks later, I sat at my desk, still working my reinstated job, which now included a 10% raise and a new level of professional respect from Ethan. I thought about the total cost of their control. The emotional debt, the financial theft, the professional risk. The war was over. I opened the encrypted drive that contained the entire family audit folder. All the bank statements, the LLC documents, the signed withdrawal slips, the evidence of the Allison trust theft, and every single threat they had sent me. It was all organized, labeled, and perfectly secured. Clicked the folder. I didn't need it anymore. The truth had been executed, and the system had been purged. Keeping the evidence meant keeping the connection, and I was finished with that. I hit delete. The computer asked, "Are you sure you want to permanently delete this file?" "Yes." I confirmed. The folder vanished, gone forever. For 26 years, I had carried a debt that wasn't mine, a cost of living imposed by people who viewed love as an investment ledger. Now, the account was closed. I looked out the window at the distant, quiet city lights, feeling a profound sense of lightness. I had gone through a calculated strategic demolition, but I rebuilt myself stronger, using logic as my foundation and competence as my currency. I had gained clarity, self-worth, and absolute freedom. Zero debt. Zero guilt. Regrets.